Well, welcome to the podcast. Yes, here's your host, Rob Elliott. And it's funny, I'm talking to an Australian today, but on the other side of the world. He is an international best-selling author. He is a futurist, and he's what I call a financial disruptor. He lives in New York, and I can't wait to get into this. Welcome to the show, Brett King. How are you, buddy?
How you going, mate? Thanks, Rob. It's good to be able to get my break into my Aussie a little bit. I didn't get to use it so much out here in the States. They don't understand you, so, when you talk Aussie.
Mate, I remember talking the first time I was in the States, and I did the normal Australian thing. I joined all my words together and just got this look of, huh?
Yeah.
And I had to slow down and speak. So, it's you can talk as much Australian slang as you like. And even though it is going to go around the world, we might have a bit of fun with it. And I'll probably get some people messaging me going, what was he talking about? So this is going to be an obvious question. Where did you grow up?
I'm a Melbourne boy.
Really?
I was born in the eastern suburbs of, I was born in Dandenong.
Yes.
Lived in Springvale in the early days. I think probably the most significant input into my growth in those early years was I got to attend Melbourne High School, which if you know anything about Melbourne High School or North Sydney Boys, they're select entry schools. So you have to pass an entrance exam to get in. And I was living out at Berwick at the time, which is on the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, if your listeners not in Melbourne. The career choices I had out at Berwick High School was a Sparky or a Chippy, pretty much. And I was very interested in computers. So I wanted to get into a schooling system that supported computers. This is back in the 80s. So 82, I started at Melbourne High, only graduated there in 85. They were incredibly formative years. There's a lot of very famous Aussies that have been through that system. And I was really, it was a huge gift to be able to have that experience. So grew up in Melbourne, worked in Melbourne and Sydney, 93, moved to Sydney, moved back to Melbourne in 96. And then 99 left Australia. I did 6 years in Hong Kong, 5 years in Dubai, and I've been in the States 11 years, and I'm about to make a move to Bangkok, Thailand. So a real global citizen these days.
Wow. Well, did you do university or study in Melbourne when you finished school, or did you do that in Sydney?
Yeah, my parents weren't big supporters of university, so I studied part-time, and I ended up at Chisholm University, which is now part of Monash, on the Caulfield campus, studying computing, doing a undergrad or a bachelor's degree in commerce with a MIS or information systems major. But I dropped out of that because I was programming. As soon as I left school, I had a job as a coder, and the job just got too much. And then years later, in 97, I entered a entrepreneurship program with Bond University, which led to mature age selection for their MBA program. Yep. I did the first year of that with Bond and then I moved to Hong Kong. So I ended up dropping out twice of university. But what was ironic is I moved to Hong Kong in May of 99. And in December 99, I started teaching the e-commerce elective for the Australian Graduate School of Management for their offshore program in Hong Kong. So I ended up teaching, teaching the MBA, and then I ended up teaching Bachelor of Commerce at City University in Hong Kong because of the work I'd done on the MBA program. So I don't know too many who've ended up being ASPROs or adjunct professors that haven't actually completed university themselves, but. That's the way the world works, I guess, right?
What drew you into computing? What was the topic or the thing that made you like that?
I've always been sort of a frustrated science fiction author, and these days I'm branded as a futurist because I'm often writing about stuff that's going to happen over the next 30 years or so.
Yeah.
I was in a hurry to get to the future. And so I saw technology as one of those tools, but also I just found synergy in my life with the course computing was taking in terms of its advances and where I saw the world going. So I guess, I guess in those early days, I was just a real techie.
So when you moved around the world early, was that through work of their choice, or did you leave and jump to another opportunity? How did that all come about?
Well, initially I was working for Deloitte in Melbourne.
Yep.
And I led a technology infrastructure group, as a senior manager. I'd owned an ISP for a few years, an internet service provider business. It was acquired by Telstra. Telstra played some real dirty tricks in that space, but we won't get into that. But ended up, because of my business experience, going to Hong Kong to run a few projects, for Deloitte there. And the Hong Kong team sort of noticed me. They didn't really have anyone specializing in the business arena. It was obviously, back in 98, 99 was growing fairly rapidly. So went there for 6 weeks and ended up, a few months later, making the move permanently. And then after that, it was largely opportunistic, but the recent move to the US coincided with the launch of my first book, which you can see there, Bank 2.0. And that sort of started me on a whole different career as a thought leader, author, a player in that space. And the US seemed like the logical location to be for that. It wasn't easy to get a visa for the US, even though I had sponsorship and so forth, but ended up being a resident thought leader for a digital agency, ad agency. And then, I started my own fintech startup, Movin, in 2011.
We'll get into that shortly.
Yeah. And then 2013 started a radio show, and I've continued writing books all throughout the process. It's just so where opportunities have taken me, I guess.
So you're making tech sexy again.
Well, I think one of the things I've always prided myself on is the ability to communicate between technologists and people with no technology background, to make it approachable and inclusive. And that was something that always, helped me in my early career. But I think the technology's moving so quickly these days that people really can't grasp the rate of change of things that are happening in society. And so that's sort of become my mission right now, is to help people adapt to the rate of change that we're experiencing as a result of technology innovation and other pressures and stresses that are coming on the system right now.
And I can't wait to get into that, because I've got some real life examples to throw at you. And I'm sure as a futurist and someone who helps people and that, you're going to love it. Movin, someone said to you, I read up and they said, you're a financial disruptor, but using technology. Where did the idea for that come about? And how was it? I mean, the disruptor used to be someone that went in a negative term, but these days being called a disruptor is a positive, because you shake the apple tree.
Yeah.
So where did Movin come from, and what was the catalyst to get it going?
So you're probably familiar with Volt or 86400, in Australia. These are called mobile challenger banks, right? But Movin was the very first mobile challenger bank in the world. That is, it was the first bank account that was offered through an app where you signed up in the app to get a debit card. We were the first organization that ever did that. And that was back in 2011, so very early in the piece. And the original name comes from very simply a domain that we acquired, which was Move and Bank. And so it became Move and Bank because we contracted it, but then we couldn't use the term bank because in the US, they weren't offering licenses to digital players at the time. So we had to drop the bank. So we just became Movin. So that's sort of the history behind the naming convention. But the idea was, Move and Bank was a bank account that moves with you, that's embedded in your mobile phone, that helps you access banking when and where you need it, and coaches you as a smart bank account on how to better use your money. That was really the creation of Movement back in 2011.
Look, I see technology, especially COVID, seems to have got hold of the digital world, put a whole heap of gas into it, and just gone bang. We've gone like Back to the Future. It's its own DeLorean. We've all gone, wow.
Right.
A lot of the technology, but the people I spoke to, was always there. They've used COVID to bring it out of the back of the office and just flood the market. I remember about 2.5 years ago at my Rotary Club, we have an awesome treasurer. And we're sitting on the board, and I said, look, it's time we went to FPOS so people can just pay when they come to the meetings. No, that's never going to happen. People won't use it. And I looked at him and I thought, now my Rotary Club has an older age, a lot older than me. Latest Rotary Clubs do, and we're changing. But we went, he said, you'll have to do 30 transactions a month to make it worthwhile. We have 45 people in our club. We now do 99% of the transactions through FPOS. These guys are on average age between 75 to 85. They love it. And someone said, why do you love it? He said, my hands are full of arthritis. Getting change out of my wallet. He said, I can just pick my card up and go bang. I go to the club and get a drink. I go bang. I go to a shop with it. Technology scares a lot of people. A lot of companies that haven't kept themselves up to date have now been forced through COVID to go full tilt into the digital age. Are you seeing some companies fall over because they refuse to adapt? And how does a company, when they have to make that step change, work on the change management to get people to embrace technology when they usually run away from it?
Well, there's been plenty written about this, Clayton Christensen and the work that he did on, disruptive innovation and so forth. The fact is, every time we have a major leap in technology, there are victims that tend to be incumbents in those industries that don't change or that try and emphasize, that their business model is going to, sustain themselves through this disruptive period, and it never does.
Ask Blockbuster about that.
Yeah, exactly. Blockbuster, Borders, you name it. You can go back to the horse and cart, and the disruption of the combustion engine. In 250 years, when we've seen technology disruption over that period, when we've seen technology disruption emerge, the number of industries that have successfully defended their business model against that technology, zero.
Yeah.
Right. And so it amazes me that, when industries face this type of disruption, that you've still got players that insist, no, everything's going to be fine. Everything's, we're going to resist this. Let's take the coal industry in Australia at the moment, or fossil fuels. Yeah. It's absolutely inevitable, not only for the fact that we need cleaner air and water. 8 to 10 million people die every year from air quality issues, but, climate and all of those things. But already solar and wind power in Australia are 1/20th of the price of coal. It's more expensive today to run an existing coal plant in Australia than it is to deploy an entirely new solar farm for generating electricity. So you're like, well, why is there resistance to this? We've got Tony Abbott a few years ago, coal is good for humanity. And I recognize that from an economic perspective, coal has been a very important aspect of the Australian community. But we're fighting against a tide that's inevitable. And Australia, for example, would be, one of the world beating economies on solar if we got our act to gear. We've got the perfect environment for solar energy in Australia. We've got solar silica as a raw material that we could use to build solar cells. There's all of these benefits in that. But the disruption of moving from coal-based electricity to solar is not easy, and not an easy one to solve. And so, that's a great example right now of disruption that we know is going to completely change the way we think about energy systems. But we see a ton of resistance, and it's not just that resistance not just happening in Australia. No. Look at the Trump primaries. We're going to bring big coal back. It's a problem globally that we face with this type of attitude.
But how do you look at countries in India and China claim one thing on the global stage, but it's still building coal stations and But at the same time, especially India, they've got some amazing tech and some amazing ability to go the other way. Do you think sometimes countries can be as bad as old businesses where they just put their head in the sand and they govern for today rather than someone like you who looks to the future?
Well, the political will is a real challenge there in terms of getting broad support, but most of that comes down to lack of education, not necessarily policy. You know, if the government was smarter about saying, look, this is inevitable. We're going to retool the economy to focus on these jobs. Solar will be one of the biggest employers of new jobs if we can, you know, and retooling energy infrastructure, which we're going to need to do for climate resilience anyway, you know, and so, you know, let's get to it. China's an interesting one. China has obviously, because of the massive growth in their economy, their demands for energy are peaking right now.
Yes,
but China has deployed over 260 gigawatts of solar in the last 5 years. To put that in perspective, the US over the last 40 years has deployed 60 gigawatts of solar generation capability. So, but China just can't do enough solar, and they don't have enough battery, you know, grid level storage at the moment to wean themselves off coal. However, they have committed to no more coal plants as part of Belt and Road. I think that's an important move.
So how does big business educate and look at where we're going to go now in the future when it comes to technology and that? If there've been, a lot of them have got very well-meaning boards, but they don't know what they don't know. So how does business look at it? It doesn't matter what size, and go, okay, so what am I going to do to move and keep going rather than so I don't end up like a blockbuster when it comes to technology in future?
There's a lot of blockbuster contenders in
series,
you know, around the globe right now. I mean, we see, for example, Philips and General Electric and companies like that now being broken up into smaller units, and you know, there's some seismic changes. If you look at the trend, 9 out of 10 of the world's top companies today are technology companies. But the interesting part of that is these technology companies employ far less people than the leading industrials or the leading companies of the 1960s or even the 1980s in respect to their ability to generate returns and profit. And so that's a worrying trend, because if you apply artificial intelligence into that mix, around 2030, between 2035 and 2045, that's going to produce real structural changes in the economy, where human jobs that are essentially process-based are going to be eliminated by things like robotic process automation, algorithms, and you know, robotics. And so structurally, that's a massive change. It's almost a delinking of labor participation from the basics of supply and demand economics, because now your ability to produce supply to meet demand is based on processing cycles than it is people working on the floor of a factory. So we're going to have to find different jobs for humans for, you know, as we get into the latter parts of this century. And part of it may be, you know, we also have to have things like a universal basic income potentially, or social safety nets for the disruption, or large scale retraining programs. You know, I think our children, for example, if you've got kids in university today, you know, my son's at UNSW right now. You know, if you've got kids at university that are learning finance, for example, there's probably a 50% chance that when they come out of that university program, the job that they were being trained for doesn't exist anymore.
I spoke to someone doing marketing, and they said anyone in their right mind would not go to university or college anywhere in the world and study marketing. And I said, why? They said, because if the book that they're studying out of, and it's a terminology book for the younger people listening, hasn't been written in the last 2 years, it's out of date.
Exactly.
And he said they're teaching them things that people don't use. He said the best marketers, the best marketing companies in the world aren't employing on what degree you've got. They're employing on how you think, what you do. They don't even read your resume if they're smart. I mean, Gary Vee proudly says, I don't read resumes. I sit in front of somebody, Richard Branson the same way. It's the same thing going to happen in finance, because now we have cryptocurrency. You've got one side saying it's a fly, it'll go away. Other people are saying it's the future. And then governments are saying we can't control it, so we're not going to help it. is cryptocurrencies around the world, is that going to be the new way, whether we are going to deal with them, or will it go up and go down and maybe just find its niche in the finance market?
Firstly, here's a few sound bites that help with this, suggestion that these new players are going to go away. The cryptocurrency market has a 3 trillion market cap right now. That is 3 times the size of Microsoft, as an illustrator. Wow. So to suggest that this is just going to go away when there's that much money captured in the system, I think is incredibly naive.
Yep.
All of the fastest growing financial services organizations in the world today, the top 100 fastest growing companies, are all fintechs. They're not traditional financial services players. So what that means is we've got these massive fintech brands all, building market share so that by 2030, most of the largest financial institutions in the world will be fintechs, not traditional banks or incumbents. That is happening right now. We're seeing that take place before our eyes. So, what is happening is we're having a modernization or digitization of the financial services system and money to match what's already happened in commerce. So commerce has already become digital. E-commerce, obviously the pandemic accelerated that, and the 21st century is going to be based on digital services. So you'll get telemedicine, which will be digital. Your kids will have increasingly be used remote schooling mechanisms as well. Certainly to improve quality mixed with classroom time. You've got your ride hailing services like the Ubers and so forth. You've got digital content like Netflix and Apple. We're digitizing the entire world. And so it makes sense that we try and look at money that works better for commerce in the digital world. And geographically based fiat currencies don't really fit into that schema of the way commerce is merging for the 21st century. So that's why cryptocurrencies happen now. And then how governments have responded to that is they tried to stop it. They were unsuccessful. First of all, they didn't think it was going to amount to anything. And when it did, they tried to stop it. There was too much momentum. And now we see institutional investors getting behind, Tether and Bitcoin and Ethereum. But we now see government responses. So China is producing the world's first broadly available central bank digital currency, the digital yuan or yuan. Yeah. And that is going to be what you use to buy stuff at the Beijing Olympics. If you go to the Beijing Olympics next year, you won't be able to buy anything with cash or plastic cards. You'll have to use a mobile wallet that is linked to the Chinese bank digital currency. And China's response to crypto has been to sort of create a fiat crypto, right? A central bank led currency. The US has been very slow on this stuff. And so that's another reason why China is going to surpass the US as the world's largest economy, is that they're just built better for sort of 21st century, economic, infrastructure and capability.
Now, I was doing as I do, I stalk all my guests before they come on and have a look around. And you are an international best-selling author. And a lot of people have raised concerns now over the power that these technology companies hold, the power the government are holding. But you've also got a new book. And now I'll be honest with you, I haven't had a chance to get into the book, but the title, it did spike my interest, Techno-Socialism.
The Rise of Techno-Socialism, yes. Written with a fellow Aussie, Dr. Richard Petty.
Yeah.
So in the book, we talk about 4 potential futures for humanity. And so we studied this over the course of about 4 years that we put this together, and we had to rewrite parts of it as a result of the pandemic.
I know firsthand about that.
Yeah, but we looked at 4 potential futures. Yeah. So I'll try and find that for you as a chart in here while we're talking. And that was based on really the issue of, growing inequality. So let me try and get that for you there.
That's there we go. Yeah.
All right. And so they're the 4 quadrants. So when when we talk about how to map out those quadrants, we use two axes: inequality or exclusionary economies, very individually focused economies like the US, versus more collective focused economies like the Nordics, as an example, and more inclusive economies. And so that was one of the axes. And the other axis was chaotic futures versus planned futures. So where we just debate it and argue about it for so long that by the time these crises hit us, we're unprepared, versus really saying, well, let's figure out a way to lower carbon in the atmosphere, or put seawall defenses around Sydney Harbour so that Sydney isn't flooded inevitably in 2050, right? Things like that. And so when we look at those four quadrants, we came up with four major scenarios that we're going to see play out over the next 30 years in the world. A rejection of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, because of the ethics issue, because of bias, because of increasing dominance, as a result of data by governments and technology companies. So rejection of technology, let's slow this down. That's the Luddistan scenario, named after the Luddites. Then we have the Faldistan, where we have, Bangladesh and Maldives as a nation are completely obliterated by sea rise because the world community just waited too long to do something serious about those issues. And we have New York flooded, Miami flooded, Sydney, Calcutta, Shanghai flooded because, we just didn't take enough action proactively on sea rise. And that produces political collapse and general chaos, right? So they're the two negative scenarios. Then we have neo-feudalism, which is sort of really where the US is right now, where corporations control policy, the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. And so if you want access to things like in the future, in the 2030s and 2040s, something like longevity treatments that allow you to slow the aging process, you'll only be able to get that because if you're the richest persons, won't be available to the general public. So, the neo-feudalist state is really where we bake in this inequality that we see in economies like the US and the UK these days. And then the other, the what we call optimal humanity is where we use technology for the broader good. We reduce the size of government and the cost of government significantly so that all these universal basic services can be such as education, healthcare, housing, food, and so forth can be provided to citizens as a basic function of the economy at far less of a cost than what it costs to govern today. And that, so, by applying these technologies, for example, in the US, you could reduce the cost of US healthcare by 70% over the next 2 decades.
I've heard some great stories there.
Yeah.
Look, it's interesting. You being a futurist, you love to challenge everything that's going on. When you read the book and when you reread the book now, do you see any of that actually happening? Any bits of your book?
Yeah. Well, this is why we had to rewrite it for the pandemic stuff, is because, during the pandemic, for example, we saw, a number of things happen. We saw inequality increase. So the world's billionaires, their wealth surpassed $10 trillion for the first time during the pandemic. So, like in the US, the billionaires in the US as a class are more wealth than the bottom 90% of the American population, which is a pretty shocking statistic. But that was accelerated during the pandemic. But we also saw, for the first time in Venice, you could see the bottom of the Venetian canals for the first time in hundreds of years. We saw, the air quality in Delhi clear, so that residents in parts of India could see the Himalayas for the first time, since the 1950s. These sort of collective changes that we went on, working from home, which became a new modality of employment, and is now, as employers are trying to get people back in the office, people are saying, no, we don't want this. A lot of really interesting stuff came out of the pandemic. So in answer to your question, yeah, absolutely. We are seeing, sort of ticking the boxes on a lot of the stuff that we started researching and writing about 4 years ago, but that ended up in the book for sure.
Here's one you don't know that's coming. I read and heard that someone said that working from home is the start of the breakdown of the local community because people stop interacting with people and retreat to the safety of their home office.
Actually, there's an argument for exactly the opposite, right? Which is that if people work from home, they have more time to invest in the local community, and they end up being able, because they've got the flexibility of working schedules, they can work, from the local coffee shop or elsewhere, and so they can support local businesses. But having said that, there is a change in the way we think of work in society that's occurring. And so if you look historically over the last 100 years or so, we've reduced working hours by 20%. I know it doesn't feel like that for those of us that are putting in sort of 15-hour days and so forth, but that's the reality in terms of average working hours. But as we automate more and more of our labor, we're going to be seeing people going to 4-day working weeks and maybe even 3-day working weeks, as employers just are trying to distribute enough work to their existing employees to keep them employed, right? Because of high levels of automation. But if you get to sort of the mid 2040s, by that stage, we've automated so much of society that half of the jobs that exist today have sort of disappeared. And while new jobs are being created, they have a high technology competency. Again, we're not training for those jobs properly right now. So we're probably going to have labor shortages as well as high levels of techno unemployment simultaneously. And that's where it gets really interesting, because in the second half of this century, work is not going to be something you do to put food on the table anymore. That basic function will be provided by the economy as part of the automation of the economy. So the work that you do will be work that you're passionate about, work that you feel strongly about, work that you're employed in to change the world or help local communities. And what's interesting, we looked at 72 trials conducted around the world for universal basic income as an example. And most people, when you talk about UBI, will say, oh, this will produce these couch potatoes. They'll sit there and they'll do nothing because they don't have to work, right? Guess what? Exactly the opposite happened, which is astounding. But there's a much higher rate of entrepreneurship in groups that receive universal basic income. The number of people that start their own businesses who have UBI is much higher than the sample set in the standard population. We see people getting much more involved in community activities with UBI because they have more time to put into things that they feel passionate about, such as local causes. So, the role of work is absolutely going to be one of the greatest philosophical challenges we have as we figure out that humans as a species and individually have far more value than just our economic output for corporations. And that as a species, we can do a lot more for the advancement of humanity if we're not having to work a dead-end job just to put food on the table, and we can really pursue things of real meaning and real note,
You must be very unpopular with a lot of the people in big business because you actually challenge very much what they say and what they do, which I think is fantastic. I'm one of these people that love listening to people who just are passionate about what they say. They challenge everything because I believe in disrupting. I believe in challenging and carrying on. If a business person or a board came to you and said, right, we're looking for our next 10 years, what we're going to do. Technology's running quicker than what our people can keep up. Finance industry is moving quicker than now what business can keep up. If you had one or two things anyone in business should be concentrating on, what would they be?
The first would be broad technology competency at the executive committee level.
Yep.
So making sure that everyone is tech savvy. And if they're not a technologist, making sure they embrace technological change. Because the more resistance that you have to that at the executive level, the more likely it is that your business is going to be disrupted, right? And so that's the first thing. Make sure that there's a high degree of technical competency. Secondly, build a culture in the organization of embracing change versus concern about risk. In traditional businesses, change is seen as a risk, particularly in, say, financial services.
It is.
And so the organization culture becomes very risk adverse. No one wants to be responsible for introducing a change. No one wants to fund a change because that introduces unknown risks into the business model. But the reality is disruptive competitors are already doing that. So if you can control the rate at which that happens within your organization, rather than letting outside competitors do that, it gives you much more control over that migration to the future state. So embrace experimenting, embrace prototyping, embrace, within the organization, people coming up with sort of left field ideas and experimenting with them, rather than the immune system of process and policy shutting that stuff down because it's not what we do. It's not the way we do things.
If a young person came to you today and said, look, I'm finishing my high school next year, and said to you, what should I study? What would you say to them?
Well, I think one of the core skills of the 21st century is going to be adaptability, the ability to learn new things. So I would say, pick a couple of really diverse areas. In the first year of university, just pick some stuff that, left field stuff. Maybe environment would be good, or tech or whatever. But pick a few really diverse areas, just so that you can learn, different subject areas quite dynamically, and so that you learn the skills of lifelong learning, essentially. But then pick something that there's this concept in Japanese called ikigagi, which is like something that you love doing, something that will help other people, something that you can get paid for. It's sort of like a combination of all of these things. So find something that you're passionate about that will fix problems in the world. And I think that's all we can be expected to do as a contribution to humanity.
So, Brett, before we go, if people wanted to pick your brains, wanted to buy your book or get in contact with you, how do they find you?
Well, I'm on all the social channels. So, at Brett King on Twitter, Brett King Author on Facebook, Brett King on LinkedIn. You can go to brettking.com, my personal website, or you can go to Rise of Techno-Socialism, which is the new book that we have, riseoftechnosocialism.com, or technosocialism.com as well. And, check out the new book there. I'm always up for a chat on social and debating this stuff. So just ping me there, particularly on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I'm happy to take, questions offline or online, as it may be, and continue the conversation.
Mate, I look forward to coming back to you in about 12 months after your new chapter, when you move house to the other side of the world again. It's been an absolute hoot listening to you today. I love that you're shaking the tree and getting people to look outside their little square box where they feel comfortable. Nothing's ever been achieved in the world if we just kept doing what we've always done. So thank you so much for taking the time.
I'll keep going like a rat up a drain pipe, man,
Mate, I hope some of you people in America know the hell what you're talking about, but I certainly do.
All right. Well, thanks for the support, Rob, and all the best there in Sydney with the future disruptions.
Mate, we're going to have a hoot over here. Look forward to being able to get on a plane and meet you in Thailand. And as we always say at the end of every one of our podcasts, have a groovy day.